people always look at me strangely when I mention I have an 18-year-old son. I'm 33, but when James and I go out together, it's not uncommon for people to ask if he's my little brother. He looks like he could easily be in his 20s, and honestly, so do I. The last 18 years have had their challenges, but I like to think I did the best I could, given the circumstances. It all started when I was just a freshman in high school. I knocked up my girlfriend. Her parents were ready to give the baby up for adoption, but my mom stepped in and helped me get custody. My son, James, is a straight-A student. He's the point guard on the school basketball team. I managed to scrape together enough to buy him a decent car. He's popular, something I never was at his age. By the time I was his age, I already had a 2-year-old son, a GED, and a dead-end job at the local pellet factory. We live in a small, 2-bedroom duplex a few blocks from his high school. James does his homework without much prompting and spends his free time with friends or, more often than not, in the living room kicking my ass at Call of Duty. For a while, I thought he might be gay. Not that I would have minded, but it seemed odd that a boy his age never had a girlfriend. So, I asked him about it one evening. He smiled, shrugged it off, and said, "No, Dad. I'm not gay. I just want to wait until I'm a little older to get out there. Wouldn't want you to be a grandfather in your 30s. That was the extent of our sex talk. Between the internet and the sex ed classes I had to sign a permission slip for, I figured he had the basics down. A few months ago, he told me he was going out late. I asked why, and he casually said he had a date. No questions, no hesitation. I slipped him a $100 bill and told him to be home in time for breakfast. He was a good kid. I trusted him. After that, it became a routine. Every Friday afternoon, he'd let me know he was going out. Each Saturday morning, he'd be home, sitting on the couch, playing Xbox by the time I climbed out of bed. I never met any of his dates, but I didn't mind. I figured he just wanted to keep things private, which, honestly, seemed normal for his age. I trusted my son, he was level-headed, and I had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. I don't normally watch the news. Between my Facebook feed and Twitter, I usually catch up on current events when I need to. But for some reason, on this particular afternoon, I found myself sitting in front of the TV. As I flipped through the channels, I paused on the local news. I didn't know then, but I wish I hadn't. The screen cut from a commercial to the anchorwoman's serious face. She looked directly into the camera. Her voice was tight with tension. Later tonight, we'll cover a developing story. Several local women have gone missing. The police were looking for clues, trying to determine whether the disappearances were connected. We live in a sleepy little town, where nothing much ever happens. The thought that something like this could be going on so close to home sent a chill down my spine. The idea that my son could be out there, with everything that was happening, scared me more than I wanted to admit. I talked to James about it, trying to calm my nerves. He told me not to worry. James was a big kid, just under 7 feet tall, with a broad frame. I wasn't worried about someone being able to jump him. But being a big guy myself, I knew that size meant little if someone else had a gun. Still, he reassured me that everything was fine. But just to be safe, I swiped his phone while he was asleep. I installed an app that let me track his location at all times. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I remembered what it was like being 17. You think you're invincible, nothing can touch you. I didn't think much of it after setting the app to hidden mode. I left his phone on the charger in the kitchen and didn't give it a second thought. If I ever got worried, I could pull up the app on my own phone, see where he was. As long as his location wasn't too out of place, I'd calm down and go back to watching Netflix. Meanwhile, I started following the case of the missing women online. It had become a bit of a media frenzy. 6 women had disappeared over the span of 10 weeks. They were from different walks of life, different ages, different appearances. No bodies had been found, but the police suspected foul play. Then, the 7th woman went missing. My stomach sank. I hadn't seen Rochelle in 10 years. She'd come back around when James was 7, trying to do the whole mother thing. But she wasn't cut out for it. After a few months of broken promises and missed visits, I filed for a court-ordered drug test. She failed. I immediately filed another motion, stripping her of any visitation rights. I didn't want my son exposed to that chaos. It was Saturday morning, and I hesitated before going downstairs. James and I didn't talk much about his mother. She'd spiraled out of control after having him, using any drug she could trade her body for. By the time she came back to visit him, she looked like she'd aged 20 years in just 7. Her arms were covered in track marks, and her teeth were yellow, decaying. To be honest, I was surprised she was still alive, surprised she hadn't been abducted herself. With a heavy heart, I approached my son in the living room. "Son, we need to talk about your mother." James sighed and paused his game. James looked up at me, his expression hardening. "What did she do this time?" I sighed. "She went missing last night. They found signs of a struggle at her trailer." He didn't flinch. He just stared at the TV like he was looking right through it, then unpaused his game. Without turning to me, he muttered, "Yeah, well, that really isn't news, is it?" James and I didn't talk about his mother much. He never liked to. One of the main reasons I had to involve a lawyer was because of something that happened during one of her visits. She picked him up, took him to her apartment, and, apparently, a few customers came by while he was sitting on the couch. His first real visit with her turned into a nightmare as junkies sat next to him, trading $20 for a hit as they used right there, all while he just sat, a silent witness to his mother's descent. 3 hours later, a guy named Steven dropped James off at the house. He was there when I got home from work. I asked him what happened, but all he would say was that his mother didn't want him there anymore. He'd sat outside without a jacket for hours. Of all the things that could have happened, I was more relieved than anything that it wasn't worse. I had heard horror stories about situations like this, stories where kids didn't come back, or came back scarred in ways you couldn't even imagine. I got James into therapy right away. Within a few years, he seemed to get back to normal, and his visits to the therapist became less frequent. After that, he'd only ask about his mother once every couple of months. I think he may have brought her up once after that night. The following week, he let me know he was going out again. Another date. My usual worry crept back in that night, and I couldn't help myself. I pulled up the app on my phone. He drove to a house on the other side of town, and then, just as before, he headed out to a place in the middle of nowhere. I hadn't thought much about the app since I'd set it up weeks ago, but as I scrolled through the logs, I noticed something unsettling. He'd been to that spot in the middle of nowhere at least 4 times in the past 6 weeks. But what really stopped me cold was the place he'd been the night Rochelle went missing, her trailer. My mind started racing, but a part of me refused to believe what it was all starting to suggest. If it had been anyone else's kid, I'd have put it all together in a heartbeat. But this was James, my son. I couldn't bring myself to face it. Instead, I threw my phone down on the bed and grabbed a bottle of whiskey from my nightstand. I drank until the world started to blur, and then I passed out. When I woke up the next morning, my head was pounding. James was downstairs, playing Dark Souls and eating a Pop-Tart. I knocked back a Red Bull to shake off the grogginess and stumbled to my car. I couldn't sit with it anymore. I had to know. I was going out to that spot in the middle of nowhere. I had to see where my son had been taking his dates. I really wish I hadn't. I really wish I hadn't. My GPS led me down an old gravel road, one that had fallen into disrepair. The car bounced over potholes and ruts as I drove, surrounded by dense forest on either side. After about a quarter of a mile, the trees broke open to reveal a small clearing with a pond at its center. I parked at the edge of the gravel, my heart pounding harder now. I got out of the car, feeling the chill in the air, and walked toward the water. I could see remnants of a campfire near the edge of the pond. The ashes were still warm. For a moment, I sighed in relief. My son had found a quiet spot to take his dates, somewhere peaceful, under the stars. I almost felt proud of him. But then I saw the footprints. They led toward the pond, and from the marks in the dirt, it looked like someone had dragged something heavy to the water's edge. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't stop myself from walking closer to the murky water. As I stared at the dark depths, a chill crawled up my spine. I turned back toward the fire pit, and that's when I saw it, bloodstains on the grass behind me. A knot tightened in my chest. With dread pooling in my gut, I waded into the water. About 10 feet out, my worst fears were confirmed. My foot pressed against something hard. I reached down, my hand trembling, and felt a thick, rusted chain. I pulled on it, my hands slick with cold sweat. As I tugged, something heavy shifted beneath the surface. Slowly, I dragged it into view, a waterlogged body wrapped in a blanket. I hesitated, but I had to see. I pulled the cloth back, and a bloated face stared up at me, Rochelle. The blood drained from my face, and I quickly wrapped her body back up, pushing it back under the water. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned and ran back to my car. I sped home, but when I pulled into the driveway, I couldn't move. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to figure out if I was having a panic attack or a heart attack. My chest hurt from how hard my heart pounded. Tears streamed down my face as my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just discovered. I tried to tell myself a dozen different lies, conspiracy theories, anything to explain away what I had found. Anything to keep myself from believing that my son had something to do with this. Then, someone knocked on the driver's side window, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was James. I climbed out of the car, my legs shaking, and he wrapped his arms around me, his voice soft. "Whatever it is, it's okay, Dad. Just tell me what happened." For a moment, he was the good son I knew. I almost forgot about the pond and the body I had just found. But then reality crashed back in. I followed him inside, my mind numb, my body drained. After changing into dry clothes, I sat in the living room, staring at the floor. James sat across from me, waiting. The silence between us stretched on for what felt like forever. Finally, I broke it. My voice was barely a whisper. "I found your mother." His response wasn't what I expected. It wasn't shock. It wasn't anger. It was the same flat, emotionless tone he'd used on the rare occasions he'd talked about her. "Yeah, I figured," he said. I had caught him doing something he wasn't supposed to do. I looked him in the eye, desperation rising in my chest. "Please tell me you didn't do anything stupid, son." He looked away, shifting uncomfortably. "Define stupid," he muttered. I raised my voice, the fear and anger mixing together. "God damn it, James, did you kill your mother?" He laughed, low, humorless. "That was dead a long time before I clocked her over the head and dragged her to my car. Any that had tried to sell their son for dope has been dead for a long time." The words hit me like a sledgehammer, and I couldn't speak. I had always wondered about that night, but James had never said anything. Never talked about it. I could barely process what he was saying. James kept talking. "You know, really, I looked out for the __ that paid for me, gave me a ride home, and told me never to go back to her. I guess it could have been worse, but honestly, that was the day I snapped. I understood what life really is. Of course I killed her. She deserved to die 6 times over." Tears welled up in my eyes as the weight of his confession hit me like a freight train. My son, my 17-year-old boy, had just admitted to more than 15 murders. He spoke without hesitation, detailing things no child should ever know, let alone speak about. His voice was steady, calm, as if he were recounting some casual memory from years ago. I sat there, frozen, my mind struggling to make sense of the words. What could I possibly say? What should I say? My son had confessed to being a serial killer. The only thing that crossed my mind was how to make sure his life wasn't ruined by this. I finally forced myself to speak. "We need to get you help, son. This isn't healthy." He cut me off before I could say anything more. No, Dad. Therapists aren't going to help me. You've been good to me, so I'll spare you the bull, __. We both know that when I turn 18 in about a month, I'm out of your hair. Besides, I've got bigger plans. I stared at him, really looked at him, trying to understand how this beautiful monster had come to be. 17 years of being his parent. 17 years. And in all that time, I never could have imagined that my son would turn out this broken. I quit my job about a week later. By his 18th birthday, I had burned through most of my savings, drinking and trying to forget what I had learned. Trying to forget him. Sure enough, the day after his 18th birthday, he was gone. Any part of me that had hoped he'd turn things around, that he'd find a way to heal, was lost. A few weeks later, police discovered the bodies in the pond, the ones I'd found with my own 2 hands. By then, James was long gone. I got a postcard a few weeks ago. A picture of a sandy beach. The words on the back were simple, "Hey, Dad. Just letting you know I'm fine." I left it on the table next to the door. I didn't pick it up, didn't even think to. I just went back to drinking. Part of me wants to go to the police, tell them everything. But the other part, the part that still somehow loves my son, even after all this, knows I'm the one who made him this way. And I'll never be able to undo it. It probably wouldn't be that hard to track him down. Still, he's my son. I'm willing to do plenty of things, but handing my son over for the crimes that would put him on death row? That sits way beyond my level of civic duty. The guilt grows heavier with every passing day. For now, all I can do is hope that he's truly fine. I don't know where he is, and honestly, I don't want to. All I can do is hope he's stopped killing. He really was a good boy, at least once upon a time. He's tall, charismatic. If he'd just put his mind to it, I'm sure he'd make it big. But deep down, I know, he's already past that point.